Let's go back and review who Talt Hall was for a moment. At one time, he was the assistant to the Deputy United States Marshal of Floyd County, Kentucky, and his job was to help hunt down moonshine steals and capture moonshiners. He did this for a short time. The circumstances behind his leaving is unclear. Talt Hall was also tied to the Confederate side of the Civil War, and during that time he was tried and acquitted for the murder of Henry Maggard. It is claimed that he killed as many as 19 to 99 men, but he only admitted to Henry Maggard, Daniel Pridemore, Nat Baker, Henry Triplett, Henry Hoke, Mac Hall, and later on to Enos Hylton. However, we have found a story of Frank Salyers, who was murdered by Hall or a member of his gang. Frank Salyers would turn out to be the linchpin in the story of Hall. Because of Salyers' death, Hall would end up in 3 feuds, murder 2 men, and end up on the gallows. Whether or not Talt Hall killed Salyers over a woman, Hall's life would forever be changed by that one event. As Paul Harvey used to say, quote, "Now for the rest of the story," unquote. We will cover the account given by Dr. Spence, as reported by the Roanoke Times, while Talt was sitting in the Lynchburg jail, awaiting his appeal that would never come. Dr. Spence talks about a feud that started over a Christmas dinner at Beaver Creek and extended for quite some time over Letcher, Knott, and Floyd counties. We will also cover the connection between the death of Frank Salyers and the death of Enos Hylton. Why were Hylton and Hall at odds? And could this event have been self-defense as Hall claimed? How was Hattie Taylor and Helen C. Hylton connected to this murder? And why were these 2 ladies important to this particular case? While in jail, it is often said that Hall loved to torment Dr. Taylor. Why would he do this unless there was a deeper connection other than what was told to us in the Pound Gap Massacre? Could this have been a family matter that turned ugly, or could they have been friends all along? We will cover these questions and more in this section of the Talt Hall story. So, it is that time again that we all board the time machine and go back in time and find out more about Thomas Talton Hall. But before I start, I need your help. I can drive the time machine and do the narration, but you need to push the like, subscribe, and bell notifications so that the time machine can get started. This helps us so that we can get a bigger time machine and take more people with us. And without further ado, here we go. Elkerton Turner. Now, before we begin, the story of the death of Elkerton Turner actually took place shortly before the death of Enos Hylton. This account will give the story of the feud between Turners and Sizemores and how this extended out and ended with the death of Elkerton Turner. Turner's death was reported in the Roanoke Times by an interview with Dr. Spence, who was a cousin of Elkerton Turner. This was not a death that Talt Hall himself had confessed to, nor was he tried for the event. The following is the words of Dr. Spence that are found in the newspaper. Quote, "Talt Hall," unquote, continued the doctor, quote, "was born in Floyd County, Kentucky, and had been in a feud all of his life. He confesses to having killed 19 men, and the gang to which he belonged have killed over 100. He inherited the feud. His father, old Talt Hall, killed 2 or 3 men. My impression is that the feud started in 1875 at a Christmas dinner given by Jeff Turner at his house on Beaver Creek. There is a row between the Turners and the Sizemore, in which Jeff Turner and Bug Sizemore were killed and some 8 or 10 were wounded. Old Talt Hall espoused the cause of the Sizemores, and the feud has been going on ever since. It extended over 3 counties in Kentucky, Letcher, Knott, and Floyd. I have been in the territory frequently, but a stranger is in no danger of being injured unless he takes sides. Two of Elkerton Turner's uncles were in the row down on Beaver Creek, the member of the House added, but Elkerton was killed while acting in his capacity as an officer of the law. Talt Hall went to a neighbor's and stole a Winchester rifle and the neighbor's daughter, and was making off with both. The old man swore out a warrant, and was given to Turner to execute. While endeavoring to make the arrest, Turner was killed by Hall, but had succeeded in wounding his adversary desperately. Hall escaped, and though close search was made for him, no trace of him could be found, except in caves in the mountains, where there were evidences of his wounds having been dressed by his friends. Then he was lost sight of, until he turned up in Norton and killed an officer." Unquote. So, according to this account, Hall was wounded and recovering when he went to Norton, Virginia. But there is something not to be missed here. Hall was living with his wife Renda, Salyers' widow, and now a neighbor's daughter, and all of their children. We will get into all of the accounts as to why Talt went to Virginia in the first place, and how and why he got into the fight with Hylton. Police Chief Enoch, Enos, or Amos B. Hylton. On July 14, 1891, Hall murdered Police Chief Hylton of Norton, Virginia, in front of many witnesses. Some sources state that the death of Hylton took place on July 25, 1891. But this is what we have discovered. Hattie Salyers Taylor, Helen C. Salyers Hylton, and Frank Salyers were all brother and sisters. Sylvan Taylor and Enos Hylton were brother-in-laws to Frank. This will become important information in this section of the story. Also, one of Talt Hall's gang members was named Miles Bates. Bates was recognized and arrested by Hylton for his part in the crimes that the Hall gang had taken part in. These events set up what was to happen next. According to the evidence that we have found so far, from witnesses and possible motives that we will get into, an argument between Hall and Hylton began and ended with the death of Hylton. The murder. According to the July 31st, 1891 Big Stone Gap Post, there was an account given for the murder. Quote, a warrant had been sworn out for the arrest of Miles Bates and associates of Hall's, and given to Hylton for execution. Armed, alone, with the authority of the law, he went out to find Bates. He had not far to go. He came upon the latter a short distance west of the depot. He arrested him and disarmed him. Talt Hall, coming up, demanding the release of the prisoner and the return of his arms. Mr. Hylton, seeing that he was completely in the hands of this man, did as he was ordered. Then, without any provocation whatsoever, Hall discharged a shot at Mr. Hylton, who knocked the pistol aside. A second shot was fired, the ball striking the victim in the side and causing his death a few hours later. Hall and Bates were holding Hylton by the arms when the last shot was fired. Hall fled, and Bates is in jail at Wise Courthouse. Unquote. Let's take a moment to look at this, shall we? First, you have the reputation of the men involved. Hylton was a loved and respected lawman that was known to be just and fair. Then you had two outlaws that had several warrants out for their arrest. That was the first strike against Hall and ensured that his side of the story would not be believed. Then, let's break down what might have happened at the crime scene. Talt Hall was with a gun telling Hylton to release Bates and give him his guns back. Hylton does this. There is no reason for Hall to shoot Hylton after this point. However, Hylton throws a gun to the side about the same time a shot is misfired and doesn't hit anything. Then you have Hylton's arms being held all of a sudden by two men when the second shot rang out. Now, I wasn't there. However, by this description, it seems that when a gun was thrown, Hylton used this as an opportunity to try to disarm Hall by attacking him. In the scuffle, Hylton was shot. Was this a case of self-defense or straight-up murder? We will let you, the viewer and reader, decide. We just give all possibilities so that you, the 13th juror, may make a verdict upon it. Motives. There seems to be several motives for this crime. Hall would claim self-defense in a fair fight. Could it be that Hylton attacked Hall to gain advantage over the situation and lost? Could it be that there was so much animosity between the two men that Hall felt that he had to protect himself? The newspapers of the time tell a different story. According to the Daily Public Ledger on September 3, 1892, quote, Hall claimed on his trial that he had not seen Hylton before that day, which was possibly true. But it is not believed that the murder's only motive was the refusal of Hylton to release his prisoner. Hall had eloped with a married woman named Salyers, who was the sister-in-law of Hylton. Shortly after Salyers was assassinated, it is now pretty certain by the hand of Talt Hall. Hylton is said to have sworn to kill the man who murdered his brother-in-law, and it is pretty certain that Hall heard of it and took advantage of the fact of Hylton having Miles Bates under arrest to pick a quarrel with him and kill him, unquote. This story would change. According to the Alexander Gazette, printed on August 29, 1892, Talt Hall would have a conversation with his sister, Mrs. William Bates, and badge on right from behind bars. The newspaper would tell a different version of the events. Quote, when Talt Hall was on trial for the murder of Hylton, he testified that he never saw the man until the day he killed him, and that he not whatsoever had anything against him. A friend of Hylton says this much of the story is true, and he went on to state that the secret to the murder was that Hylton and Clabe Jones were enemies, and that in a fight at Hyman, Kentucky, which was precipitated by an attempt to arrest Jones, Hylton was shot in the face. Hylton was a very brave man and was feared by evildoers, and to gratify his feelings, he went to work to have Hylton assassinated. He found a ready tool in Talt Hall, who went to Norton for that purpose. The money found on Hall's person when arrested at Memphis, amounting to several $100s, was paid to him by Clabe Jones for the deed. Jones and Hall had been bitter enemies until a short while before the murder, when Jones hunted him up and made friends with him. Unquote. So, there were possible motives behind the murder of Hylton. While many of these motives have never been discussed among all of us who dive deeply into the Pound Gap massacre, this finding actually sheds new light as to the motives behind Hylton's death. We will link up Dr. Taylor's part in this story shortly. However, we would like to show all sides of the coin. The attempted escape. Knowing there was too much evidence against him, Hall fled the area on July 25, 1891. First, he hid in the woods and fled through the forest to Coburn, Virginia. He hid among the bushes for some time there. According to the Roanoke Times, he roamed the woods for a month. From Coburn, Virginia, he made his way to Memphis, Tennessee. According to the September 8, 1892 Valley Virginian, Talt Hall had been employed as a cab driver while in Memphis. While employed, he was recognized as the man who was wanted at the Wise Courthouse for the charge of the murder of Enos B. Hylton. A Memphis police officer named Pride recognized Hall and arrested him. They needed a lawman and Hylton's widow, Helen C. Salyers Hylton, to come to Memphis, Tennessee, to positively identify Hall and extradite him back to Gladeville, Virginia, for his trial. Dr. Taylor volunteered to go for personal reasons. His daughter-in-law's sister was the widow of Hylton, and Hylton had been a close personal friend of the family. Now we pause. Let's link some things together. You have Frank Salyers killed. His widow has taken up with his possible murderer, Talt Hall. You have Salyers' brother-in-law, Enos Hylton, being murdered by the same man that just killed his brother-in-law. Hylton's wife, Helen Salyers Hylton, is the sister of Hattie Taylor, who is Dr. Taylor's daughter-in-law. Who is to say that Hattie herself went to Dr. Taylor, who was acting as U.S. Marshal at that time, to personally escort Helen to Memphis to pick up Hall for extradition? Upon their return, Doc extended his personal duties to guard Hall, as there had been many attempts to release him from the Wise jail during the week of his trial. After sentencing, Taylor would once again transport Hall to Lynchburg, Virginia, to await his execution. It was some time after the delivery of Hall to the Lynchburg jail that Taylor would resign his post as U.S. Marshal. Trial and conviction. According to the Roanoke Times on January 30th, 1892, it was reported that the trial was at an end. Even though there was trouble expected from his friends from Kentucky, the trial and verdict passed by quietly, as there was no rescue attempt. His trial had ended a full 4 months before the events of the Pound Gap massacre would take place. This would make it impossible for Dr. Taylor to have snuck off to kill Ira Mullins and his party while guarding Talt Hall during his trial. It is possible that Hall had said something to Taylor at this time that caused him to give up being a U.S. Marshal. All we know for sure is that shortly after this event that Dr. Taylor laid down his badge. We now have the names of the attorneys involved in the case. According to the Big Stone Gap Post on February 5th, 1892, they reported that the lead attorneys would be Judge C.T. Duncan for the prosecution and Colonel J.B. Richmond for the defense. Duncan would be assisted by Robert Bruce, George A. Ewing, I.S. Ross, and W.S. Matthews. Richmond would be assisted in the Hall case by his son H.C.L. Richmond, J.D. Carter, and O.M. Vickers. According to the article from the Roanoke Times, on January 30th, 1892, the newspaper reported, quote, "guilty of murder in the first degree," unquote. Is the verdict rendered in his trial today for the murder of policeman Hylton of Norton, unquote. Quote, "It was 3 o'clock this afternoon when the jury filed into the courtroom and announced that they had agreed upon a verdict. The courthouse was packed like sardines in a box, and the prisoners showed but little agitation when the clerk read the verdict. The jury was polled, and each man answered that murder in the first degree was his verdict. The jury was out 12 hours before they agreed," unquote. Even though there was trouble expected from his friends from Kentucky, the trial and the verdict passed by quietly, as there was no rescue attempt. Hall would be transported to Lynchburg immediately for safekeeping. Every precaution was taken to prevent a jailbreak. From the sources, we learned that the first gallows date was set for June 4th, 1892, but it was stayed on account of waiting for the appeals. Appeals. This case went before the Court of Appeals of the State of Virginia, according to the Roanoke Times, reported on June 24th, 1892. Quote, "The case decided today in the Court of Appeals were as follows. Talt Hall versus Commonwealth from Wise County. Judgment affirmed. Opinion by Judge Lewis. Judge Richardson dissenting. Judge Hinton not sitting," unquote. Reported by the Valley Virginian on September 8, 1892. Quote, "The case was then carried to a higher court, where the decision of the lower court was sustained. Meanwhile, Hall had been carried to Lynchburg for safekeeping, and then the case was passed upon in the Supreme Court of the state. He was brought back here to be resentenced," unquote. Time has now run out for Talt Hall, and he was once again brought back to Wise County Jail to await his final time before a judge. While at the Wise County Jail, he would once again meet Dr. Taylor. There are two stories as to what happened while he was there. Dr. Taylor arrested. On May 14, 1892, at a place called Killing Rock, that sits just below the Pound Gap on Pine Mountain on the state lines of Kentucky and Virginia, 5 people were slain. Ira Mullins, Lorenza Mullins, Wilson Mullins, Greenberry Harris, and John Chappell. Please refer to our Killing Rock series for more information. In July 1892, Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor was captured while trying to escape in Pearisburg, Virginia, on his way to Florida, with plans to go west from there. Dr. Taylor was taken to the Wise County Jail to await his trial. This event and time is important because this will be the place where Dr. Taylor will again see Hall. Governor McKinney. According to the Alexandria Gazette on August 29, 1892 edition, quote, there are rumors circulated throughout the state that a petition will be sent to Governor McKinney to commute the sentence of Talton Hall. In consequence thereof, petitions were sent to the governor yesterday by ex-attorney General R.A. Ayers and citizens of Kentucky, asking the governor not to interfere with the sentence, unquote. Many appeals from Talt, his friends, and family went to Governor McKinney. According to the Evening Bulletin reported on September 1, 1892, quote, a special from Blue Ridge Springs says that Governor McKinney has wired the attorney for Talt Hall as follows. After a careful examination of the papers in this case, I decline to pardon or commute the sentence of the court, unquote. Dr. Taylor sees Talt Hall. Was the relationship between Taylor and Hall everything as it seemed? According to the oft-told tales about the Killing Rock story, they had a very adversarial relationship, and Hall took great glee in tormenting Taylor. But was this so? We were not the only ones to have doubts upon this issue. According to the August 7, 1892 issue of the Richmond Dispatch, quote, there is no doubt whatsoever but that Talt Hall's friends are preparing for his release, and that they will combine with Taylor's friends or his own enemies. Taylor fears the latter probably, and has declared several times that if Hall is rescued, he will be hung. Many think that the enmity between the two men is pretended. That Taylor went after Hall and guarded him to see that he had a fair play scene between the two at the jail was worked up for its effect on the guard. Many claim that the two have been friends all the time, unquote. Now, we have an account that is over 130 years old that has just turned the idea that Hall and Taylor were total enemies. But this will make more sense when you take into account that Taylor would not have been the only one to believe Hall about the killing of Hylton. Was it an unfair trial? According to the August 7, 1892 Richmond Dispatch, there were many of Hall's friends and family that felt that Hall had not done the crime and that he was convicted unfairly. Quote, Hall's friends claimed that his trial was unfair, that the judge and jury were prejudiced, and they have another grievance, in fact, that Hall, a Kentuckian, would be so closely guarded, while Stallard, a Virginian, who had murdered a Kentuckian, could be released from jail by half a dozen of his friends. It is known that only one thing will prevent an attempted release, and that is a strong guard, and it is believed that even this guard will effort be made, unquote. Attempted jailbreak. According to the Daily Public Ledger on August 18, 1892, an attempted jailbreak was planned. Quote, an attempt will be made by his former associates to rescue Talt Hall, the noted outlaw, at Big Stone Gap, Virginia. They will meet with desperate resistance, unquote. According to the August 7, 1892 Richmond Dispatch, the idea of a planned jailbreak had been released to the press. Quote, "Certain it is, they are on perfectly good terms now, and both are warm friends of a certain famous Kentucky detective, who has a record of 29 men, and who, it is thought, will take the leading part in an attempted rescue. Reliable news has come to this point that the Kentuckians have ordered several thousand cartridges, and that 2 men are riding from point to point through the mountains forming a band of rescuers." Unquote. Which 2 men? Could that be Dr. Taylor and Talt Hall? And which detective with the record? Well, this is not spoken about directly in the article. We can only speculate at this point who this detective could have been. Let me say this. I cannot name someone I have zero evidence in proving. So, I will let those who have studied this speculate as to who the identity of this third person is. Talt Hall prepares to meet the gallows. It is reported in the Roanoke Times, printed on September 3, 1892, that Hall had spent the last few of his days drinking whiskey to help alleviate the horrors of his upcoming date with the gallows. He had been showing signs of breaking down, and had spent a very restless last night of his mortal coil. Hall had set his bed on fire to burn down the jail, but this was stopped by an on-duty guard. Quote, when asked for his reasons for this act, he laughed and he replied that he wanted to smoke Dr. Taylor out of his cell. Unquote. According to the newspaper article donated by Eileen Williams Sanders, it was reported on September 1, 1892, that he set fire to his clothing and bedding. He will be closely watched tonight. If these 2 men were friends, why did Hall try to smoke out Dr. Taylor? Was it because Hall was slowly losing his mind? Was this an attempt to escape? That if the air became dangerous to breathe, that handling the 2 men at once and the confusion of the smoke would give both men a chance to run for it? It's possible. The last goodbyes. According to the August 29, 1892 Alexandria Gazette, Hall was visited by his sister, Mrs. Bates, and other relatives, including John Wright. Quote, John Wright, Talt Hall's best friend, was over from Kentucky to see Hall last Tuesday. He said, quote, Hall, you have been treated like a dog. You have not had a fair trial by a blank sight. Unquote. Quote, Hall recently told his sister, Mrs. William Bates, in the presence of the guard, that there were 3 men he wanted her to have put out of the way, if it took to the last feather out of her bed. She asked him to tell her their names, but he refused to do so, as he could not speak to her privately. He said, though, that he would tell her before he was executed. Unquote. History has never revealed who these 3 men were, and we will never know if he got the names of the men to his sister. The day of the gallows. According to the Roanoke Times, printed on September 3, 1892, the day before Talt Hall had been legally executed by the law of the Commonwealth of the State of Virginia, it is estimated that over 4,000 people were in attendance. That no rescue attempt, protest, or demonstration had been made to help Talt Hall in his hour of need. Quote, notwithstanding large crowd in town, only those whom the law allowed saw the execution. It was 23 minutes past 12 when Talt Hall was led from his cell, and the march to the scaffold commenced. The condemned man was attended by Father Lucky of Lynchburg and Father Lynch of Roanoke. He walked with a firm step, and his lips were constantly moving through prayer. Arriving at the scaffold, he ascended the steps, still attended by the 2 priests. Hall immediately took his place in the scaffold, The floor fell, and Talt Hall was no more. However, the Valley Virginian, printed on September 8, 1892, has a different version of these events leading to the gallows. According to the paper, Hall's iron shackles were taken away from his limbs and replaced with ropes. While he was escorted to the gallows by the two priests, they remained at the foot of the gallows after Hall had bid them farewell. Only a limited number of people were in attendance. Only the guards, county authorities, jail officials were allowed in the gallows enclosure due to the fear of riots and escape attempts. He was able to make the last speech in which he said that he had killed Hylton in self-defense. Thomas Bad Talt Talton Hall was executed by hanging for the murder of a police officer, Enos B. Hylton of Northern Virginia, on September 2, 1892. He was 42 years old. It has come to our attention. Like most stories that we are doing for the Appalachian Outlaw series, there is a possible memoir that is attached to this story. The first 8 pages seem to be missing from a copy that everyone has. However, Talt Hall is not the first outlaw to have written while he was in the jail awaiting his sentencing. We would love to know if you are interested in having us to read these memoirs so they become available for everyone. While we cannot print copies, we, however, can read them word for word as they were written before 1923. If you would like for us to do that, please let us know in the comments section below. So far, we have come across the memoirs of Clifton Branham, Talt Hall, and Henry Red Bill Hall. If you know of others that are out there and that could be read, please let us know. Special thank you. We wish to once again thank those who have helped us to gather information about the people in this series. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living could not do the amount of research, the storytelling, that we do without the help of some great historians and friends. We have a special list today of people that we wish to thank. Forgive me if I mispronounce your names. I'm going by how they are said in the mountains, so if there is a different way to say it, I apologize beforehand. Eileen Williams Sanders, Randall Osborne, John White Sr., Vicki McPeaks Tackett, John Johnson, Mark Wade Baldwin, Judy Brock, William Taylor, Catherine Melinda Melton, Charles Broyles, Diana Sloan Moore, Joe Johnson, Teresa Reynolds Horn, Dwight Collins, Kevin Hall, Virgie Cogan, Rebecca and Johnny Mullins, Connie Hall Boggs, Frida Stewart, and a very special thank you to Hillary S. Clark. Thank you. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Outlaws. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell for notification. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.